Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. First webinar of the back to school period. The subject is forever changes following the pandemic, forever changes in higher education. Of course, this webinar is not the first time I've addressed the subject of how the COVID pandemic has affected higher education at global level. I've addressed it quite a few times in the past. I've written about it. But the difference between what I've said about it or written about it in the past and what I can say today is that more recently, reports have emerged that are moving away from assessing the immediate impact of the pandemic, the massive move to online, to remote learning, the impact on international student mobility, etc. All of these themes that we're all familiar with by now, to explore the possibility of permanent changes brought about by the pandemic, which I want to emphasize in passing has been called by a joint report released in May this year by the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF, as has been called the worst education crisis on record, which sounds pretty dramatic. So today we'll be looking at three different areas in which, by a growing number of accounts across the professional literature at various recent education conferences, we may see forever changes, permanent changes once the after effects of the pandemic are well behind us. These three areas are, there they are, okay? These are the three areas I selected for today. There are others, of course, but you always have to make a selection when time is limited, so you tend to select what seems to be the more crucial topics or issues. The rising concept of the student consumer, which I'll develop in a minute, mental and emotional needs, general well-being of students, which is emerging as a very strong post-pandemic subject, and then the mainstreamization of hybrid and a la carte higher education, which I'll define a little bit more clearly once I get there. These are my three subjects for today. I'll start with the rising concept of the student consumer to say, first of all, that marketing studies show, this is in general, this is not about higher education, marketing studies show that crises can produce new trends in consumer behavior, and that these trends can become entrenched. They're not just, in other words, they emerge as responses to a crisis, but once the crisis is over, they can become entrenched. And they can endure well after the crisis has subsided. Typical new consumer behavior following a crisis, for example, is the demand for simple, unsophisticated, value-oriented products or services that provide, first and foremost, convenience. You will see that convenience is a key term, except for subject number 2, in subject number 1 and subject number 3 that I'll be exploring today. A number of forecasts now assert that this will increasingly apply to the higher education market as well in the coming years, as educational options available to learners keep expanding. These forecasts claim that as the focus on higher education as a pathway to employment, which has been an ongoing developing trend of the past decade, will keep growing, the consumer student of the post-pandemic world will favor year-long hybrid offers that come with strong career counseling services, strong placement services for graduates. In other words, more and more students will behave as consumers. Students will develop needs and explore the higher education market as consumers would in any consumer market other than education. That this is a robust emerging trend is documented by a number of surveys. For example, an Into University Partnerships study. Into University Partnerships is an international education specialist. This is a study that was carried out last year. That's my next slide. There it is. Yeah, that's the one. The study carried out last year among 1,200 Gen Z or Z, depending on where you are, students in a total of 93 countries, including China, India, Nigeria, Kenya, Japan, Australia, Brazil, with the results that you can see here. 55% of these students post-COVID-19 pandemic are considering a new career path, which they would not have considered without the pandemic or did not consider before the pandemic. 49% want a career that offers better work-life balance. This is also a direct outcome of the pandemic. And then 45% want to launch their own business. In other words, they do not want to join the corporate world as employees, but they want to be entrepreneurs. All of these are direct results of the pandemic. The same survey before the pandemic would absolutely not have given these figures. Here's what Olivia Stretfield, who is the CEO of this organization, Into University Partnerships, here's what she said about what the results of this survey show. This is the quote. I'll let you read it. Radically altered the attitudes, career aspirations, etc. And then she says that the change will come to define the world of higher education and work, define or redefine, okay? And then she warns that governments, universities, the industry should pay attention, that this is a significant shift among young people. A whole, I think this is the key term in the quote, the key phrase, the whole generation that is eager to learn and work differently. Again, a direct outcome of the pandemic, and one that is likely to reshape the landscape of higher education for years to come. She adds that, and I quote, the current generation of students are more outcome-oriented than their predecessors, that they demand concrete returns on their investment. Okay, so that's pretty clear. These findings are echoed by another study, a 2020 OECD survey of 48 countries, which is called Youth and COVID-19 Response, Recovery, and Resilience. There it is, where students are shown to now have unprecedented interest in enrolling at a university that assists with future employment opportunities. More and more, this is becoming a requirement post-COVID for young people, for students. This hyper focus on jobs is also confirmed in another report by ICEF, which is a market intelligence, an institution that does market intelligence for international education. This is a report that was a study that was done last year. I've highlighted the part of the findings that is more relevant to us, to our subject, which is affordable and employment-linked education programs will be even more in demand than they are now. And again, this is directly a result of the pandemic. You can see the heading here, how the pandemic is shaping the expectations and decisions of international students. So what we can see how essential career prospects have become for younger students in the wake of COVID. We can look actually at the next slide for more details of this same study of ICEF monitor with a recap of key themes that we can expect. The report says a new intensity of interest around. All of it focused on employability, skills, work, the ability to smoothly transition from education, from post-secondary education to, from from post-secondary education to the labor market, okay? Employability, graduate employability stats and testimonials. These will become key considerations for students when looking at the market of higher education, when looking at what universities to enroll in, ability to work while studying, post-graduation work, immigration opportunities. I'm not addressing this subject today, but immigration opportunities, the ability to stay and work for international students in the country, in the host country is becoming increasingly important, internships as well. And as I said earlier, career counseling resources and shorter programs and upskilling courses, which I'll address in my third part. Unrelated to this, but interesting nevertheless, which is why I'm mentioning it here, an additional theme that emerges from professional articles is that the post-pandemic students, consumers, will be just as likely to select a university on the basis of its carbon footprint and its commitment to climate change as they will be to select a university on the basis of the school's worldwide ranking. Okay, these are general trends, and there are also generalizations. There will all, of course, be variations in this trends from country to country, but the solid conclusion of all these studies is that this reinforced consumer student profile and behavior will become a key driver of change in how colleges and universities will have to adapt to student needs. Again, it's not new. We've seen this turn, this transition to a more consumer-like type of behavior among students over the past, I would say, 20 years. So what is happening here is that the pandemic has served to strengthen, to reinforce this type of approach, this type of behavior, and that this is likely to now become entrenched and long-lasting as a result of the pandemic. The next major change that I want to look at is the increased significance that students' mental health and well-being needs are going to take on over the next few years. So that's my second part. I'll back to my outline. My outline slide, student mental and emotional needs become integrated in student affairs. The rise in importance of mental and emotional issues among students as a result of the pandemic should not come as a surprise to anyone. And though it's impossible to quantify at the moment, there is no doubt that institutions of higher education will have to pay growing attention to these needs and invest increasing resources in answering them. Many studies in this area report increased depression, generalized social anxiety, eating disorders, increase in alcohol consumption among students on a scale unseen before. Again, of course, as a direct result of the pandemic, but likely to cause a change that is going to become entrenched. The OECD survey of 48 countries that I already mentioned also shows that most young people polled are more worried about their mental health than about their future employment and level of income. Another survey, a joint study called Connected Student Report, published in June last year. There it is. It's a joint study by Salesforce, Chronicle of Higher Education, and Ipsos. It's a study surveying 2,000 students and staff in the US, Spain, Norway, Denmark, the UK, France, the Netherlands, Finland, and Australia. So it's quite extensive. It finds, as you can see, that I don't know if because it's very small. You may not see the light blue on the left is students, and the darker shade of blue on the right is staff. 76% of student respondents in this survey see their own well-being as the most significant post-pandemic challenge that they will have to face. And 73%, almost the same figure for university staff. I will also mention here two academic articles, one American, whose authors note a significant increase at global level in the volume of scientific literature addressing the potential mental health impact of the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 2 years. There it is. And the other article, British, which shows an increase from 30 to 44% between 2020 and 2021 in students that could be classified as clinically depressed. That's quite a dramatic increase in just 1 year between 20 and 21, from 30 to 44%. There's the study. That's a UK sample, so this is true for the UK, but of course we can see this trends developing across the world. An increase, a dramatic increase in students classified as or diagnosed with clinical depression. All these authors underscore that it is likely that the experience of the pandemic has served to expose, in many cases, mental and emotional issues among students that existed before the pandemic, but that had not been addressed or treated. So whatever the case, whether this is a direct outcome of the pandemic or whether the pandemic here, as in many, many other areas, has simply served to reveal, to expose, to underscore a phenomenon that was developing below the radar before the pandemic, it is clear that the mental health and emotional needs of students are increasingly moving to the forefront of administrative concerns across universities. I'll give you one example. The University of California, Los Angeles, just opened a new center a month ago, funded by a $12 million grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health, dedicated to the study of depression among students. In the near future, it is assessed that colleges and universities will have to fully integrate services that deal with the mental condition and emotional well-being of students, and even train instructors to deal with these issues in the classroom. This is also a new emerging trend that is a direct result of the pandemic, but again, likely to become entrenched and long-lasting. My next item is the mainstreamization of hybrid and a la carte higher education. And this one promises to be even more disruptive, since of course this form of education no longer occurs solely in the traditional brick and mortar setting of the university, but, and that's its main characteristic and its key selling point, it can occur virtually anywhere. So mainstreamization of hybrid, going back to the outlined slide, mainstreamization of hybrid and a la carte higher education. In this subheading, actually, for this segment, the a la carte higher education bit should, in truth, be replaced by unbundled education, because this is all happening, of course, in the broader context of unbundled education, the unbundling of higher education. And the subject here is, of course, the multiple alternative options that are developing for people who want to get some form of education after secondary school without committing to a long study program, a 3 or 4 year study cycle, and of course without the significant financial costs that higher education entails in many education systems. I want to focus on hybrid first. to say that with the gradual return to face-to-face teaching and learning through this academic year, it's becoming increasingly clear that one of the permanent features we'll inherit from the COVID period will be the mainstreamization of hybrid, of blended learning, with the challenge for more and more colleges and universities to institutionalize frameworks that will be able to offer and properly implement high quality blended education, high quality blended learning models, instead of just replicating the amateurish character of the massive switch to online that was observed around the world in the first few months of the pandemic. As much as predictions in the first decade of this century that remote learning would take over the higher education market turned out to be vastly wrong, it is likely this time that a growing number of institutions around the world will want to retain the ability to accommodate the needs of a more and more diverse pool of students. And that, of course, includes the possibility for students to study remotely, at least in part, at least part of the time or for part of a program. And we can already see this trend developing across many, many universities worldwide as a result of the pandemic or in the aftermath of the pandemic. What must be underscored here, I think, is that contrary to what leaders and communicators in the EdTech educational technology industry have repeatedly claimed over the past 10 years, there is no, at the moment yet, but it's been going on for quite a while, there is no overwhelming scientifically demonstrated pedagogical advantage to learning remotely. I'm tempted to say au contraire. A number of studies have already shown actually that when learning in a traditional face-to-face setting, students learn better, that they retain knowledge and other benefits of education longer. And of course, that they enjoy, in addition, the advantages of direct interaction with educators, instructors, and the benefits of socializing with their peers, all of which, of course, are not possible with remote learning models. So the one thing that has to be clear is that if the hybrid model becomes mainstream in years to come, which is very likely, it will be based essentially on an economic rationale, one that emphasizes the advantages of convenience. I told you at the beginning, convenience will be the key word of these for these transformations. One that emphasizes the advantages of convenience to the consumer student and not based on the argument of a higher quality of learning or higher quality of education. Be that as it may, that seems to be the post-pandemic direction of travel, as shown, for example, in this study, July 2022, actually an article, so pretty recent. There it is. A possible post-pandemic COVID-19 scenario, return to classrooms with blended learning. That's a scientific article in the Frontiers in Education journal, one of multiple such articles that have been appearing in academic journals in the last couple of years, and in particular over the past year, which says that the present moment and this post-pandemic scenario, the spread of hybrid education constitutes, and I quote from the article, a pivotal moment for determining the way education is delivered in higher education. Among multiple other sources, I will also mention this UNESCO report of April 2020, so quite at the peak of the COVID crisis, which as it looks at hybrid learning as a response put forth by educational institutions around the world to ensure the continuity of education in the midst of the pandemic, also looks to the future and sees this mode of learning as possibly becoming the default one in years to come. Okay, so that's for hybrid. The other game changer I want to look at in this last segment, what I've called for the purpose of this presentation, again, a la carte higher education, is of course much more momentous yet in its disruptive potential. It presents quite a challenge for most colleges and universities around the world. Because, as I pointed out earlier, this disruption is of course taking place in the broader context of the unbundling of higher education, of the rise of micro-credentials, which I've talked and written about rather extensively, I would say, over the past couple of years, and I will undoubtedly continue to talk and write about over the next few years, simply because it seems to be the key transformative phenomenon going on in higher education today. Of course, the rise of multiple alternative paths to post-secondary education and training, alternative, i.e. alternative to the traditional university degree, so away from the traditional university degree, is not something new. It's definitely not a product of the pandemic, but there's no doubt that the pandemic has reinforced the sense among young people that other ways to train for a job are now needed. As students and non-working adults alike sat at home for weeks on end, often behind a computer or mobile screen during the lockdown periods of the past couple of years. And as the post-pandemic world of work seems to underscore the need for flexibility, and for many young people who have been financially and psychologically affected by the pandemic, the ability to join the labor market rapidly. So new models of education are therefore now spreading even more rapidly than before the pandemic. And as you all know, they are much more flexible and adaptable to all sorts of living situations. They are much more skills oriented, increasingly removed from the concept of general education, which raises, of course, a number of crucial questions, but that's not my subject today. And crucially for colleges and universities, they rely more and more on other non-academic outlets. A report released only a few days ago that was commissioned by American Student Assistance and Jobs of the Future, that was conducted earlier this year by Morning Consult. It's right here. This is just the cover page of the report, states that 81% of employers surveyed, so this is this year, earlier this year, now believe that corporations should henceforth hire based on skills rather than degrees. Okay, this is quite a dramatic finding. The same survey carried out 2 years ago would probably have yielded a much lower figure, 81%. That's quite dramatic. All kinds of hybrid models of education are therefore now developing, even more than before the pandemic, against, of course, a backdrop of technological acceleration that's not new, but of acute shortage of skilled workers across developed and less developed economies. And that's it's not a new feature that is, again, inherited from the pandemic. It's a feature that could already be seen more or less below the radar before the pandemic, but the shortage of skilled workers across economies around the world has become a key post-pandemic theme in the labor market. Okay, so an acute need for skills. As an illustration of this emergent trend, I can mention a figure released by Burning Glass Institute, which finds that job postings requiring 4-year degrees dropped from 51% in 2017 to 44% in 2021. I'll repeat. Job postings requiring 4-year degrees dropped from 51% in 2017 to 44% in 2021, with, of course, many Fortune 50 companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, IBM, no longer requiring a degree for jobs that can be done with some post-secondary training and skill development. So to align with this developing trend, more and more colleges and universities are offering new programs that are shorter than the typical 3 or 4 year program, that combine work experience, often in the form of internships that are supervised by an employer, or training opportunities, as well as opportunities to acquire a degree at an accelerated pace. So the university offer in general is now evolving to adapt to these new needs at a faster pace yet as a result of the pandemic, or in the wake of the pandemic. But of course, universities are only one set of actors in this game. And the rise of other non-academic players in these training offerings, such as remote learning platforms that are not tied to a university, more and more corporations that provide their own training, all of it, most of the time, almost all of the time, at a fraction of the cost of a traditional university program, are turning this market into an even more competitive one than was the case before the pandemic. I believe, and I will conclude with this, that this is bound to be the most, I've said this in the past, I'll say it again, this is bound to be, in other words, it appears even more clear now when we assess the long-lasting impact of the pandemic, as we can do now and could not do even 6 months ago or a year ago. This is bound to be the most significant challenge yet that universities have had to contend with in this fast changing landscape of higher education that we've seen develop over the past decade. This may bring opportunities for colleges and universities to increase the value of their programs by expanding their offerings, to include new combinations of education, practical experience, and skills training. But the fact is, not all institutions will be prepared for it or even able to integrate in it. And yet this is definitely the trend to watch for all institutions in years to come, regardless of the models of education that they're currently offering. Okay, so this concludes what I wanted to say today. Thank you very much for sticking with me, for your attention.